Hello, everyone, and wanted to welcome you to another episode of ValueCast. Today, the topic we're talking about is probably an under-discussed topic in my viewpoint, but we're really looking at the value of compliance in softwares and vendor management softwares. But ultimately, it's not just about ticking the box in the system. With me today, I've got the esteemed David Ballew. David, nice to meet you.
Hey, thank you very much for having me.
I say nice to meet you. It's not like this is our first time of meeting, but you know what I mean.
I know. I get it. It's what everybody says. That's all right. We'll roll with it.
Yeah, I know, exactly. So, David and I have known, well, since I came into the independent world a year ago now. David and I have met several times. I absolutely love this guy's ethos, his way of working, his passion for this specific topic. And it just made sense for us to sort of share with the wider community why it's so important to really delve a little bit deeper into compliance rather than just ticking that box. So anyway, David, before we get into it, why don't you, there's a lot of people that do know you, but I'm sure there are people that aren't. So maybe give a few words.
Yeah, sure. Thank you. It's been an incredible journey. We're on that border, give or plus of 30 years now. Specifically in this business. Vast majority of that was in the MSP world. Started out in the staffing, but very quickly moved into MSP, and it's been MSP ever since. So MSP, VMS kind of go together. Fast forward, started Nimble 5 years ago. And that 5-year journey has been a completely different experience than the 25 years before that, in a very, very, very positive way. And it's interesting how just the evolution over the last 5 years of Nimble going from sort of a generalist type consulting firm and all things contingent workforce to migrating to where we are today, which is full on compliance. And it's where the industry and the world is going. And so it's been quite an evolution to get where we are today. So yeah, thanks. I'm looking forward to talking about this. As you can tell, you're right. My passion is pretty severe when it comes to this.
Yeah, you're right there. We've both been in the business a very, very long time. And I remember back many years ago, everything was about features and functionality and, trying to improve that process and making everything look really, really pleasing to the eye, right? And I think we've gone through several maturity cycles of that. And it's almost like we're going back to things that are important. And it's not that they were never important. It's just that, the legislation and the requirements in specific countries over the world drive us to be a little bit more thoughtful and look a lot more at those things rather than the whistles and bells, because I think most of the systems out there have already got it. So the topic today is really about how can we adopt software, and what's the value of compliance in the software that we see within the extended workforce. But I'd like to throw it back to you and just ask you why is it important to you?
The world has changed, especially since COVID has happened, and as horrible as COVID was, and continues to be for many people, there were some really great things that came out of that tragedy. Working from home being one of them, and it has changed globally, has changed the landscape of how we engage with talent, where we source talent, obviously falling into talent pools, and how do we manage those talent pools globally. So it has changed the way the world is. And so when I think about the technology aspect of our industry, I think, okay, we had VMS rep to check. We've had that for years, going back 25 years, at least, to the very beginning of the VMS world.
Yeah.
And that technology has evolved as it needed to. But now we've reached a pivot point, I believe, in the tech world where a VMS, if it doesn't continue to evolve from a tech perspective, there already are challenges that are happening. Because the world has changed, we now have gig workers. We didn't really care about the gig workers before. Now suddenly, we want to do total talent management. Let's include the gig workers. Well, that's great as long as you can accommodate that type of worker. Gig worker meaning like Uber Eats delivery people, right? And that's different from like a freelancer who is a consultant that perhaps is getting paid a couple $100 per hour to do a very highly skilled project. Very, very different type of worker. But we kind of all lump them into the same. But that pool, or those multiple pools that are coming together now of workers that perhaps before we didn't care about, or we didn't include in the MSP VMS world suddenly are becoming driven by the client, or the clients are saying, we need to manage our total talent. How are you going to do this for us? So
Right.
a VMS is having to step up to the plate, or the VMS world is having to step up to the plate to say, okay, we can do this, or we can engage additional technology partners to help us do this. And then you get into the whole tech stack conversation. So it's a completely different world just in the last 3-4 years than it was before.
Oh yeah, 100%. You know, you can't compare. You can't compare 20 years ago to now. It literally was, a tick box exercise back in those days, right? I remember the first time I used a VMS software on an on-site program. It really didn't have much functionality. It really was just, okay, just fill this piece out, fill that piece out. Everything to do with compliance. Didn't even touch the system. So great. So it's a good reason why it interests you. Well, one, you're very passionate about it. And two, you've seen a lot of things over the years where you've seen compliance done really badly in VMS platforms. Not just VMS platform, but a number of them. But maybe for people listening, what are those key areas when you talk about compliance? How would you break that down?
I think the primary key area today wasn't what it wasn't several years ago. Today is really worker classification.
Mm-hmm.
And even more so now with labor legislation kicking in and taking effect either in the UK, US, or elsewhere. This is worker classification is global. That's not just limited to the United States. It's not just limited to the UK. This is something that is global that all countries are looking at, especially when they're talking about tax, right? Tax is important, and countries are looking for money everywhere in any place they can find it. And having people appropriately taxed, which means they need to be classified appropriately and in the right buckets, means that the tax base will be there. If they're not, the tax base isn't there. So having a tick box, and let's talk about tick boxes for a minute. For years and years and years, it was, and for some, it still is a tick box. And I'd like to be very clear. There are some VMS technologies that have nailed it and are absolutely fantastic. There are others that are struggling. There are others who are failing miserably. Similar to MSPs with the service that goes with the VMS. Some MSPs are doing an absolutely outstanding job in delivering service, and others, they're struggling to catch up. And as long as they continue to struggle and eventually catch up, that's what's important. And I think we have a responsibility in our industry to help them catch up. There's a lot of relationships that go back years and years and years with people who are associated with these organizations. It's important that everybody comes together and solves the solutions for challenges, both process and with the compliance on the legal side and the tech side. All this comes together, and that we really bang out our industry the way it should be banged out. The regulatory, back to the compliance and back to the worker classification, that is probably top on the list for most. Second down the list, and this is really probably a strange one to many people, would be pay parity.
Mm-hmm.
And it's interesting that IT organizations, suppliers are being audited, are found to be non-compliant with very basic, if you can believe it, pay rates that are perhaps below a minimum wage.
It doesn't surprise me. It doesn't surprise me, David. I've seen quite a few examples in my time.
And you shake your head and think, how is that possible? With the charge rates that we know that are going through a VMS system. Let's say it's I don't know, a developer's going through at $85 per hour. And then suddenly we find out that, there's 10 workers being housed in an apartment somewhere, each being paid $25 per day to do that job. And it's a sad reflection on I think society as a whole. But unfortunately, it's become a hot topic in the IT world when it comes to compliance, to go back and check to make sure that payroll is being administered appropriately, that there aren't contractors who are being underpaid, and suppliers who are being, quite frankly, overpaid, and not following labor laws. So that's just one example of many, many, many. We have 81 different categories that we can actually audit for in our compliance services. 81. And you think, my God, pay is just one of them. Worker classification is one of them. So it's a very, very long list.
David, you can't have 81 tick boxes, that's for certain.
No, you can't have 81 tick boxes. So you have to, within the organization, you have to decide what's important to you, right? Where are you going to focus? What are you going to do? But it's important that it's not just a tick box. That tick box needs to have a knock on and needs to lead to something else behind the scenes to make sure that what has been ticked is actually the document that's required, that perhaps the signature matches a signature on record. So it's not just a supplier signing an NDA form. The contractor has actually signed the NDA form. Another example of where fraud is happening in the world. So it's great to have a tick box, but you have to have something behind it. And then that something behind it, and this is where, you know, I would advise MSPs, and we have, it's, look, you need to have a team trained in how to audit these documents. They need to know what to look for. We did an MSP audit recently for insurance, suppliers insurance. It was 100% of the supply base was non-compliant. Some of it was minor, you know, maybe the certificate holder name was incorrect or something like that. Some of it was pretty major.
So when you say compliant, you're basically saying it's almost bastardizing the use of a tick box in a system and then not doing the work behind the scenes. Because, you know, I had a similar discussion with someone else about IR35, and you know, it's that case of saying we need to match up what is in the system and what's at the end product, and where it's falling down is no one is doing that in between, which is basically what you're saying, right?
Yes, correct. And it's happening not just with the IR35, you know, are you in, are you out question. It's across the board for everything that's happening operationally speaking behind the scenes of an MSP and a VMS. And like I said, I want to be very clear. There are VMSs and MSPs out there that are nailing this, that are doing everything possible to do it correctly and to hire the right people and to make it happen. So that this is not necessarily a knock on the entire industry. There are some that are doing a great job. There are others that have a long way to go. But you know, that's the industry, and technology now is leading that. So when you talk about, let's talk about classification just for grins and giggles here. When you talk about classification, you now have freelancer systems, you know, independent contractor, call them what you will, pick your name, for these types of technologies that have now been designed specifically for onboarding, vetting, paying independent contractors, freelancers. And they do a great job. And they're, from a compliance perspective, they've nailed it. Now, you know, how to figure out where that fits within an MSP and a VMS ecosystem, that's a whole nother conversation. We could talk another 3 hours about that, but it all needs to come together. And because the VMS world hasn't necessarily engaged, perhaps, in my opinion, as best they should have when it comes to compliance, these other tools are popping up and giving them a run for their money. And they're doing a great job at it. So
why is that though, David? Why do you think that's the case? Because, you know, in my view, it goes down a lot to the accountability, right? Who's taking the accountability? Is it a case where it's like that, you know, and to your point, there are people that and organizations that are doing it right, but there are a number that are just putting the fields in there and saying, there you go, there's the basic functionality, rather than taking accountability for really truly understanding. Like, is that one of the problems, or do you think there's other problems?
I think that there, unfortunately, is a systemic attitude of, and this is a quote, our customers aren't asking for it. It's not a problem we're being asked to solve. Really? Okay. Well, don't we as industry leaders have a responsibility to lead our client down that path of compliance, down that path of total talent management, down that path, pick your word, pick your topic in our industry. This applies across the board, not just to the one we're talking about today. And, you know, to be told, well, our clients aren't asking for it, so it's not important. Okay. All right. Let me know how that works out for you in another 5 years.
I can tell you when IRS or HMRC are on your back that it will suddenly become important.
Yes, and unfortunately, it will be on the client's back first. It'll start there, and then it'll move to the MSP, the VMS, then the supply chain, and then the workers at the end of that chain. So clients are becoming more educated, very much like if you think back, just even not that many, very few years back, where clients were really not all that educated in the MSP world. And now they're very well educated in the MSP world. I mean, thanks to SIA, CWS events, they're doing a great job educating the world. So because our end clients, the enterprise clients, are very well educated now. They know what to look for, what to ask for, and what to expect. So when you talk about an MSP program, you talk about a VMS tool, clients are much more savvy today than they were a few years back. They know what to ask for, they know what to look for. Unfortunately, because some of these tools and some of these services haven't taken it to that next level of what the client actually needs, these other tools are now kicking in. They're being designed and developed because there is a need for this, especially in the global world. Circling back to the start of the conversation when we were talking about COVID and people working from home and freelancers and gig workers and all these people who are now part of this massive economy. This is a total game changer for the world. And so technologies are popping in to fill those various gaps, freelancers being one of them. So now the VMS, we're talking about VMSs and tick boxes, VMSs are having to integrate with these tools, right? Yeah. So how does that integration work? How does that play out with the end client? How does it play out with the MSP? How is it really playing out with the VMS? Is it easy? Is it complicated? That's a whole nother conversation too. We could talk about that.
Do you see though that the MSPs, and again to your point, I suppose the BBC disclaimer that I like to put out there are other good quality MSPs etc. out there, but there are some that aren't really, I suppose, embracing the other technologies that are there and are falling short of being able to offer a solid compliance to their clients. Like I'm personally seeing that. And I find it interesting why companies might be resistant. Is it that the MSPs are worried that some of these, freelance platforms are going to come in and steal, a lion's share of their business? Well, no, it shouldn't be that. Like, I don't know. Do you think the same, or do you think differently?
I think it varies by MSP provider and by VMS tool out there. I think they all have different objectives. There is some alignment, I believe, but change management, when you look at an organization, that change has to come from the top, and really it product development. We Nimble have been engaged in PD projects for technologies, helping them work through what's required in order to meet client requirements or what the industry is asking for. And I always go back and I say to the tech provider, look, you need to have at least a couple members of the team on that development team who understand the industry inside and out.
Yeah,
they must. You cannot have a team that's brought in who doesn't understand the industry. You can't do that. But we have seen that happening. That's not the best way to develop a product. So at the end of the day, when we go back and we take a look at, okay, why are they not? I again, and I've said this in other podcasts, it really boils right up to the top. Leaders need to take the initiative to challenge their team, their C-suite team, to say, okay, what are we doing to compete, truly compete? And what are our differentiators? If you ask some of our Nimble clients, they get tired of me asking that question. Tell me about your differentiators. Tell me about your differentiators. And great customer service isn't going to be one of them. There's a list of differentiators that everyone uses. And I say everyone, I use that term loosely, but there's a long list of differentiators that people post on their websites and use in their presentations and everything else. And are they truly differentiators? No, not really. All your competitors are doing the same thing. So you truly have to it can be a painful process to sit down and go through everything that you're doing to say, okay, who are we? Who are we today? We had to do that. We went from consultancy to compliance. We still do consultancy, but we're focusing on compliance. We had to ask ourselves we had to put ourselves through that same process, right? And it is painful. And you have to set your ego on the shelf and say, okay, it's not about me. It's about what does the client, or not about us. It's about what does the client really need and what do they want?
Yeah. And otherwise, if you don't have that reset, you tend to lose your client base, slowly maybe rather than whole scale. Sorry, it was just something that frustrated me personally over, since I've been doing what I've done in the last year. It's just, sometimes I see a lack of willingness to change and adopt. There's all these new wonderful technologies that are being created, but yet some of the service providers aren't understanding it. And to your point, the ones that are noticing it are solving those problems for their clients quicker. So I just believe that, as an industry, we need to be more open to change. and not worry and protect ourselves so much. But I suppose that's why I was making that.
Yeah.
We did segue a bit there, but
I have to add on to that. There is something happening in our world. I think that's making it more difficult, which is all the M&A activity. So let's just take, you have a VMS. The VMS acquires another VMS or acquires more than one other VMS, and they bring them in, and perhaps one is made into a whatever, and maybe a lesser version for a smaller profile of a client or whatever. It's happening with pretty much all of them, I think, these days. These multiple acquisitions are bringing multiple cultures into a single organization. And now I'm going to put HR on the hot seat. From a bringing culture together and change management process for employees of your existing organization, employees that are coming from the other organizations that are now coming into your organization. And suddenly you have, over here it's a senior manager, over here it's a vice president. Okay, now what do we do? It's you might say, oh, that's really not a big deal. Well, it is a big deal to the people who are impacted by those changes. And those big deals trickle down through either your product development, your sales and marketing, et cetera, et cetera. So how all of that comes together, I think, is creating these mini thunderstorms. I'm not going to call them tsunamis, but it's creating these mini thunderstorms that people are having to deal with. And it's a bit of a distraction, really. And it's taking leadership's attention away from what is our core business? What are we here to do? We're here to deliver a technology, in this case, a VMS. Are we doing that? Are we not letting these other things distract us? Stick to what we're here to do, which is deliver a great tool. How do we need to deliver a great tool? Let's define what great is. What is a great tool?
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And I know, it was a bit off topic, but it just, it's something I'm quite passionate about, and you are too, because I do believe, if we bring it back to what we're discussing around compliance in the softwares within our industry, you have to focus and make sure that you're delivering, the need that the client has, right? And one of those needs is solid compliance. So you talked about, the classification, and you talked about the sort of legal and the pay differentiators. Was there anything else that you classify as sort of a key area that's important when it comes to compliance?
Yeah, I think data security is huge. Mm-hmm. And I think this is where we still see failures. We saw one in the last couple of weeks where there was a breach, GDPR breach. Now I will tell you, there's a common denominator, there's a common thread through the majority of the breaches that we come across, and it's people. It's either people haven't been trained appropriately, or it's a people problem of being able to take data from a system and send it somewhere attached to an email. So it goes out there into the ether, and then suddenly you're scrambling to get it all back. That's something that's quite big. So data security is another very big one. I would also throw in there, platforms. Now, this is along the lines of a VMS, but if the third-party tools, let's say freelancer tool, isn't built and bolted onto that VMS tool, you have to go out to a different platform to access whatever information that is. Sometimes those platforms, those portals, aren't necessarily built to the specification that the end client would expect from a security perspective. Sure. So the security protocols are extremely important, and that's where we're seeing failures happen when we talk about tech stack. And I've put stuff out there recently about this. This is where things are happening that people just haven't been made aware or aren't privy to, or aren't asking the right questions, perhaps during the implementation. Or even during the sales process before you make the decision to buy a VMS tool or a freelancer tool or whatever tool you're looking at. I also really want to throw out there too, from a compliance perspective, someone has to pay these freelancers, right? And if it's not the system of record, the tool itself, let's say, there's a EOR provider that's now brought into the picture. So now we've got another person comes to the party, and fun party, right? So wow, the party keeps getting bigger and bigger and bigger. How do we manage those relationships? How do we control those relationships?
Yeah.
And when you talk about AOR, EOR, are they subcontracting? And I'm not exaggerating. This is a real life example. 7 subs deep
Wow.
for a work 7 subs deep. How is that even possible? But it did happen. And it's insane. So when you start working with these providers, not all of them, some of them, but when you start working with the providers, you have to be sure of what their back office process is. How are they vetting their subcontract suppliers, if indeed they're vetting, if indeed they are subbing? There are some who do not sub, and that's fantastic. That's one of our top criteria when evaluating a partner. EOR, AOR partner is, do you subcontract, yes or no? Hopefully the answer is no. And some of them don't. And we check for that, by the way. They can tell us they don't, but we actually check to make sure if they do or they don't. Another factor in this would be, do they have in-country HR managers? Someone who can pick up the phone and have a conversation with. We're in the people business. Although we use technology to become efficient and manage compliance, people need people. There will always be a need for people. We can automate that. There can be a chatbot, there can be a robot, there can be a whatever, an AI tool that can solve all the problems of the world, but we're not there yet, right? We're not there yet. We're getting there, we're going there, but we're not there yet. So until we get there, we still need people to solve problems for people. People want
Oh, great. Yeah. David, I think every discussion I've had, we talk about some advancements in technology or specific process, but at the end of the day, there's an element of automation that you cannot remove someone checking or strategically checking a process and a document and make sure that it's correct. Of course, you can see advancements of AI is going to cut a lot of that out. But when it comes to those critical parts, to your point, well, who's going to check if there are 7 subs? I'm not sure that AI will ever get to that point, or it's the best investment to get to that point to be able to do that. Who knows? But ultimately, you still need someone to get involved in that process.
Yeah, in my brain, I know how to get there. Ask me to do it. No, I'm not a techie, but I know how we can get there to eliminate the 7. On that same subject, that the EOR, AORs, many of them have a portal, have a platform, right? And that's great. But they don't all provide you the depth or visibility, 100% visibility of who have they subbed to, so that end user client, I can log in and see, okay, Mr. Smith has an issue. Who do I need to talk to? Oh, it's not actually the EOR, AOR that we have a relationship with. It's this sub partner, and have the ability to go directly to that sub partner to speed up the process. Otherwise, you spend back and forth and back and forth and back and forth, and days goes by before you actually resolve the problem. And that's a systemic, global problem in the industry. EOR, AOR, that's just one of them, by the way. But there are some simple fixes to this, and there are some out there that are doing the right thing.
No, I completely agree with you. One of the things, just again, when we take about, you categorize 81 different parts of compliance. Some clients put them as a priority, some clients may not have them as a priority. But what really interests me is how do you solve all the problems that we see with companies or even organizations just saying, no, I know you might have more functionality, but I just want someone to tick a box. Like, do you think it's systemic about how our industry implements services? Does the problem get started at that point? So even forgetting about the technology, is it how we work as people together to actually ensure that we're fully understanding the requirements? Because I see those challenges when it comes to managing scope. And I don't know whether you feel that way.
If I'm following the thread here, I think that, again, we go all the way back to leadership. In this case, we go back to leadership at the enterprise client level. Because there for years has been a tolerance for risk. There's been a level of acceptability for a certain amount of risk. So rather than spending $500,000, $1 million on a compliance project, they'll say, I'll hedge my bet and I'll wait to see if something happens. Something hasn't happened in 5 years. I'll wait and see. Probably not going to happen. What's the probability? I'll hedge my bet and not worry about the compliance audits. Okay, that's your business decision. But I also think it's important, and unfortunately, here's another key point to this. Suppliers very quickly into a program will learn the tolerance for non-compliance. And that tolerance will be demonstrated both by the end client and the MSP, i.e. also the VMS, but primarily the MSP that's providing the audit services or should be providing the audit services.
Sure.
Where they figure it out is at the time of non-compliance being identified, what actions are taken to correct that non-compliance? Is there a corrective action request process to remedy the non-compliance? To either change the contract, do an amendment, do an addendum, do whatever you need to do to the contract on the commercial side to the point where the client is satisfied with that level of compliance, removes or transitions that risk away from the MSP, because the MSP signed up to God knows what in their MSA with the client, and the supplier has a realistic perspective and has realistically met what fits their profile of business with that particular client. So oftentimes, for example, insurance is a great one. You may expect, I don't know, 10 million in whatever coverage, and the supplier says, "Well, I only have 5 people, and they're sitting in some office somewhere, they're doing whatever, and the level of risk for that type of coverage is like minuscule. Do we really need to have that 10 million? Probably not. Let's talk about that. Let's drop it down to 1 million." But there's a process you have to follow to make that happen. If the MSP and the client aren't following a process to make that happen, then what you find is you have a supply base who very quickly realizes, compliance really isn't on the top of their list. So not important to them, not going to be important to me. I'm going to save a lot of money. Cancel. Insurance gets canceled. You don't even know about it because you're not monitoring insurance certificates or expirations or anything that goes along with it. You don't receive a notification, and boom, something happens in the workplace. Somebody's injured, and then what?
Yeah.
Then people start pointing fingers, and it's not a pleasant experience for anyone.
No, 100%. It's not. And it is interesting. I think, because, there's been so much more visibility over the last 4 or 5 years into some of the challenges that, our industry's faced. And, the number of, even if you just look at the number of cases that have come in the UK around IR35, and, the visibility on compliance is becoming bigger and bigger. So let's say if you're doing it right, okay, so, we've talked a lot about where we think there are problems and where change can happen. But if we're doing it right, what should we be doing, David, from your perspective?
I think you need to be 100%. Let's define who we are right now, right? Let's define who we are. If we are the MSP VMS, we need to be 100% transparent with our end client and with our supply chain. Everybody needs to have full transparency of what's happening and when and how things get resolved. Once you have that full transparency, then you need to be consistent in how you treat your suppliers. So whether they're a big supplier, small supplier, how you manage that supply chain needs to be very consistent. I often will say, put your HR hat on and think like an HR director, HR person, HR VP, pick your title. What's one of the primary things that that's driven into you as an HR person is consistency in how you treat your employees. You cannot have favoritism, et cetera. You must be consistent. So when something does go wrong, you can say, well, we followed our process and we are consistent with following our process. And this is our policy. This is what we do. And it's the same for everyone. So I think consistency and visibility are important. I also think that vetting your relationships, your tech partners, even your service partners. This could be background check people, drug testing people, wherever you are in the world, whatever it is you're doing. You need to have a very serious, well-defined vetting process for these service and technology providers, these third parties that are providing services to you. That's where there's a big drop in quality is in the vetting process globally. It's happening everywhere. So I think that type of relationship and those defining what those roles and responsibilities are and those expectations for when something does go wrong. So SLA, KPI, et cetera, but not just your boilerplate template, right? Everybody does an SLA, everybody has their KPIs, everybody has the MSA, et cetera. Yeah, okay. Got it. Tick that box, right? Job done. Invoice, job done. Payment received, job done. Great. Move on to the next client, right? The process is working. Well, yeah, but it's not done.
No.
It's never done.
The shall of a process works for sure, right? And you probably see this yourself where, some some providers provide an absolutely outstanding service to one client, but then you suddenly go to the next client because they're not pushing and adopting those processes or utilizing them in a way to make sure that they meet that specific client's needs. It's just like you can't fall under that banner of, but it's our global process. It's like, it doesn't quite work. You can have a global template, but you need to
Yes.
define client by
Yeah.
client.
You bring up a great point. And I'm an American, so I think I can get away with saying this. Oftentimes the American way isn't the only way, and sometimes it's not the best way. You can have a global strategy, but you do need to have a individual country process. You may have a baseline process, but there will be going outside that baseline to accommodate whether it's labor law or something within the culture, quite frankly, that's how they do business and how they do it differently. I'm not going to do a commercial here for the culture map, but I'll throw it out there. The culture map, which is a great book on this subject of how to conduct business inside these individual countries, and how to work with people. And when we Nimble are pulling together a project team across multiple countries, we always have a stakeholder from every country, mandatory, have to have a stakeholder from every country. And they have a voice at the table. They have a voice, an active voice, not a passive voice, an active voice. Because things are different. And it's amazing to me how many times if I sit in on a meeting, I'll sit in and I'll hear somebody from a country that perhaps isn't as well known as some of the other big boys, I call them. And they have some really great ideas, like really great ideas, like never even thought of it from that perspective kind of ideas. So I think it's important, that you take the culture into consideration and how you manage the change and how you manage even within a VMS tool. And that's probably a whole nother podcast to talk about VMS, global capabilities, tax, invoicing, reporting, sharing of data, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. I can go on and on and on. It's a very, very long list. Even simple things like, date format, language. There are Canada, look at Canada, like Quebec, they have a French requirement. Well, your forms and training documents have to be in French and English because the workers have the option to request either or.
Yeah.
Are you compliant with that?
Yeah.
Is your system compliant with that?
Yeah. It is crazy really because, I go back myself and, some of the basic things that should be done from a client's perspective, are still there. I'm not going to go into the details of that because we're quite on time, to be honest with you. But we go back to so consistency is extremely important to you. What else do you think needs to change, or you are seeing being done, but needs to be done across the wider community of providers?
The velocity, the speed at which change happens. Enough of let's have a meeting, let's talk about it, let's put a strategy together. 3 months later, well, let's work on a strategy together. 2 months later, let's work on a strategy together. Enough already of trying to work out what our strategy is. If you are committed to making it happen, you should be able to bang it out in 30 days or less to define what that is, what you're going to do and how you're going to do it. And then the next 30, 60, 90 days is your implementation to get it done. That's it. Unfortunately, the bureaucracy of decision-making, people who are not empowered to make decisions, and again, this flows right back up to leadership. Leadership needs to empower people to make decisions. Now, people need to be held accountable for those decisions, but people need to be allowed to make decisions, and things will move much more faster. It's these larger organizations who have the bureaucracy, whose people are not empowered to make change or affect change. This is where the delays are happening, and this is where they're falling behind their competition. Because if you're not going to do it sooner than later, somebody else is going to do it sooner, not later.
Yeah, for sure.
So that is the velocity. The velocity of speed and making it happen is sometimes that's probably top on the list because everything else you can work out. We're not.
Yeah, and your client base right now might not be savvy to certain compliance needs.
Correct.
But they will become savvy. Someone will move from a business that is very savvy to one that isn't, and suddenly things change, and suddenly it becomes a need and importance, and that shouldn't be the case. And I think that's what when when I was sort of reading through the lines of what you're saying there, obviously, yeah, accountability, making decisions, but it's really pushing to ensure that you're not waiting for the customer to tell you it's a problem. You're actually understanding that compliance is a critical part. It's more critical, and I probably shouldn't say it, but I'm going to. But the UI UX, right? Oh, we all love the UI UX of some of these systems, but is it really as important as being compliant and working with your other technology partners and the client to make sure that because HMRC or RS aren't going to come back and say, actually, you know what? It's a lovely look and feel, your system. Don't worry about the compliance. No, they don't. They don't care. And this is where, for me, the discussion around, the way our industry has been evolving over the years, it almost it's starting to flip back into actually seeing what is important, what is actually the need of these technologies out here. And yeah, of course, nowadays, David, you expect any software in the industry, any industry, to look amazing, to be user-friendly, to be super intuitive, right? You're not going to buy a system if it doesn't do that nowadays. But more to the point, I'm not going to buy a system now that handles compliance badly or doesn't work with partner systems that handles compliance badly. It might look nice, but it's useless. And I think as an industry, our client base is starting to become more aware of that.
Yeah, you raised another good point, and I will probably close right after going down this rabbit hole. But I think it's important to throw out there. That the sales cycle is so long in the MSP VMS world, right? It takes a long time. By the time you start the relationship to the time you close, then you've got another 60, 90, 120 days of implementation, then another 30, 45, whatever, 60 days before you actually get your first payment. So that time adds up to a very long time period. And during that sales process, people are coming and people are going, especially in today's world, where there's constant reorganization, there's constant M&A activity. So you start with a select group of, say, 8 stakeholders. You get 9, 10, 11, 12, 13, 14 months in, everything's going great. And then suddenly there's a change. And you now have lost 3 of your stakeholders. Those 3 have now been replaced with 3 new people. And guess what? One of those 3 new people has a relationship and worked with MSP X over there 10 years ago, 5 years ago, 2 years ago. And, we really should look at them too while we're at it before we make a decision. And then guess what? It just repeats again and again.
Yeah.
So that really pushes the pressure to get that speed to closure before those changes begin to kick in.
Correct. Because then you've suddenly got 2 or 3 new legislations to start working on as well. It's just, it's the way. And when you're a global organization covering so many countries, that's a lot of legislation to make sure you're up to speed.
There is.
Well, David, I really enjoyed talking to you. We sort of tended to segue 3 or 4 times a little bit differently. When I roll back to that initial discussion around what's the value of a VMS and MSP provider, don't just tick the box. I think we definitely went through quite a lot of specifics on that. But my real flavor from you is that don't forget about the people managing the process. Don't forget about the accountability, the consistency, and all those things that you need to do outside of the technology that gets overlooked. So we know that this is passion. You've got a big passion about all this sort of stuff, David. But what actually helps you open up that laptop in the morning outside of the joy of what you're doing to help your clients?
It's not a matter of opening my laptop in the morning. If you were here in my office, you would see I've got a very large screen in front of me, and that screen is always on. And I'm not saying this as a badge of honor. That's not what I'm saying here. My screen is always on, and I will tell you, and I've shared this with others before, my mobile phone is with me 24/7. And the people who are closest to me know my passion, which is the business. I love this industry. I just love everything about it. And so the people who are closest to me understand where my passions lie and what I'm trying to achieve, and they're very supportive. Now, there are times where I will put my phone down and I won't look at it out for dinner, for example. I'm not going to interrupt a dinner, but if I'm out for a coffee, yeah, I'm going to have a look. I'm going to see what's happening. And because we deal with people from all over the world, we have all these multiple time zones, and so messages and emails and whatever else, WhatsApps are coming through at all hours of the day and night. And I truly do try to respond in real time as best I can. I always have, probably always will. That's just how I'm wired. But I think it's important, to put the client first, you have to be available. And I'm not saying I'm not saying that you have to respond immediately, but you have to be responsive. And something that I have noticed in this is globally, by the way, something I've noticed is that, ghosting is becoming something that has been made acceptable. It's become standard, where historically ghosting someone, not responding to a communication, would have been thought as abhorrent. Like, why, what? You didn't respond? How could you not respond? Even if it's a simple no, thank you, you respond. So it's funny to me that society as a whole has changed, and even through a sales process, we get in touch with different people, and eventually, they just stop responding, and that to me is telling. It's very interesting to me that when that happens.
Yeah.
But I go back to client first, and you have to be responsive to those clients. So to go back to your original comment about my computer screen in the morning opening up, no, it's always open. It's always open.
No. Fair play.
Okay.
But quite clearly, you ever since I've started speaking to you, David, you're so passionate about the interaction of people and speaking. Oh, I didn't see that. Oh, right, okay. That's your little David tow truck.
This was mine when I was a kid. So what? I'm 60 this year, so this is probably at least 55 years old. 24-hour service. It sits right here in front of my keyboard. So there you go.
Well, thanks so much for your time. And
thank you.
I hope that people have taken a few things from this, whether it's me waffling on and getting frustrated about subjects, or it is actually the intellectual insights of David. But if you are having compliance issues, David certainly is. He's someone that I would go to for sure. So, thanks for your time, David, and we'll speak again soon.
Thank you very much.